Our next speaker is Pletcher, who's going to talk about Autism Speaks.
Great. Thank you. Thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today about our missing program, which is, quite frankly, the most ambitious scientific initiative that our organization, Autism Speaks, has ever undertaken. Let's see if I can figure out this. Yes, there we go. So on its face, what missing is it's the generation of 10,000 whole genome sequences from autism families, and then the generation of an open access database that shares that genomic data with the associated phenotypic information. And certainly our goal out of this generally is to, by putting this data and the necessary tools in the hands of researchers, to accelerate our understanding of the genetic underpinnings of autism. But more specifically, where we really hope missing delivers us to is a space that moves us beyond the general categorization of autism spectrum disorders. That really what we want to be able to do with this data in the end is begin to divide up these families into much more specific diagnoses that really capture the unique combination of genetic and phenotypic characteristics to define these genetic subtypes that then provide the information necessary to help families understand the specific health risks and the potential treatment options to their personal form of autism, which again, whenever you're talking about the entire spectrum, you're talking about something that is just too heterogeneous to really wrap your head around and be truly hypothesis driven. And then certainly from the perspective of an advocacy group, we are ultimately answerable to those families, to the people who donated the samples from which this genomic sequence is available. So certainly part of our long-term strategy with this program is to eventually in some way make available to these families, to the donors, some level of information that derives from their sequence. So that way then they can incorporate that into their own journey and be able to use that information to guide how they think about their child and their child's diagnosis. And that's really where we want to end up with this. And so when you think about what's going to be necessary to drive that kind of result, we really do need to build a pretty big tent that can incorporate a wide diversity of individuals who have their own unique questions for this particular data set. And so certainly from our starting point, it's easiest to think about, and where we certainly are starting, are with your more traditional type of users of these data sets, your academic researchers, your large or mid-sized pharma companies, and clinical centers. But we also need to be, in working through this process and thinking about how we're developing our portal to be able to access and to work with this data, we also want to bring along these other kinds of sort of non-traditional users, or certainly other types of ones that we know tend to use it downstream. So, for instance, we do want to, there you go. We do want to make sure that we include folks from the diagnostics industry, so that way we can quickly and efficiently translate these results potentially to tools to begin to identify these genetic subtypes within the clinic. And then, of course, as I already mentioned, at some level, we need to be able to make sure to share this back with the patients. As far as what we're actually doing right now in building this portal and being able to build, at least at the starting point, a research portal, something that could support investigation of this data. Our primary partner in this has been Google. And so all of this information is being placed onto the Google Cloud from which then people can access and work with the data. And then again, just to reinforce the idea that really our goal here is to make this data as broadly available as possible and to encourage as many people as possible to work with the data. Autism Speaks is taking on the cost of both just hosting the data within the cloud, but then the downstream analysis, that the computational time on the cloud that will be necessary to begin to interrogate this data, that's cost that Autism Speaks is also covering as well. So how do you actually get access to this data? And of course, this has been a work in progress, and it still is, in trying to establish what the access policy was. And our key partner here has been P3G and Bartha, who you've heard many times, her name mentioned many times through the course of this meeting, in trying to figure out how we can sort of walk that line and to reduce the obstacles and the hurdles as much as possible, while still protecting the privacy and still honoring the consents. And so right now, the point that we're at right now, this is the process that we have established, is one where an individual who is interested in gaining access to the data would provide us, Autism Speaks, with a basic description of the research question they want to ask, as well as sign a data access agreement, a contract. They would provide that to us. We would do a basic level of analysis, ensure that the credentials are in place for that the credentials provided are true, that the scientific question is valid, and that it's feasible to answer with our data set. After that, then the application gets transferred to P3G, which will serve as our DACO, and they will review and determine whether or not finally we can grant approval to this individual, at which point then we'll receive that information and turn on access to that individual to be able to then access the data and work within the Google Cloud. And really, this whole process, once we receive the application to the time in which there's a decision, should only take about 5 business days, unless, of course, the institution is interested in haggling over the details of the data access agreement, because then you get lawyers involved, and you can imagine how long that tends to spread out the timeline. But generally, the idea is to turn around decisions very quickly, so that way we can get people in and get them working with it as quickly as possible. But of course, at this point in the process, the samples that we're working with, the samples that we're generating the whole genome sequence from, come from collections where the informed consents that were used didn't foresee what we're trying to do here. They didn't foresee generating whole genome sequences and sharing those broadly. And so there are potential obstacles here, or limitations on the way the data can be used and who can access it, that isn't necessarily our ideal state, or where we want to eventually be. So for the time being, we have to have certain limitations placed on that, including things like the fact that you either have to have an IRB approved protocol or an official exemption from an IRB before gaining access to it, or an institutional co-signature, which really, both of those kind of limit the type of individual that can access it. There's a prohibition on downloading the data, so really you need to work within the cloud. And then finally, right now, with the samples we have in there, there's a limitation on only asking questions around autism and related diseases. But again, that's not where we want to be. So as part of this process, we're also working on a new informed consent, a universal consent document, where both going forward, as new samples are collected, they'll be brought in with the conditions that would allow the fuller sharing that we really envision for this, but also with the potential to go back and reconsent individuals. So that way, eventually, we can get every piece of data in this database in the kind of context that we want, to allow the much more broad investigation that we really foresee for this program. So as far as how you access the data once you're granted that access, there's 2 ways to come at the data within Missing. One is that we are building a web portal. So if you want to ask questions simply as, have you ever seen this particular mutation within this collection? Or what are all the variants seen within this particular gene? These are the kinds of questions that you can easily and quickly come at through the web portal. But at the same time, if your interests are much, that you want to ask much more detailed questions, or you really want to query the data in a different way than what the pre-computed annotation allows, certainly you can also access it through the Google computational platform, and you can come at it through any sort of R-based scripting approach and be able to query in a much more detailed way and ask your own novel questions of the data set. So as far as how real is this? So at this point, we have completed sequencing on over 3,000 genomes, and all of those genomes are now either already in the cloud or in the process of being uploaded into the Google Cloud. there's another 1,300 samples that are at our sequencing center, our contracted sequencing center, that are in the process of being sequenced and should be available within the next month or two. We're on schedule to hit our goal of 10,000 genomes by the beginning of next year. The web-based portal that I mentioned, we hope to have that officially rolled out by the end of the second quarter, so in another month's time. Also, the universal consent that we talked about, we're working hard on that and hope to have that available within the next couple months so we can begin that reconsenting process. And then finally for next year, where is one of the big steps for us, is thinking about this community portal, to be able to find a way to be able to serve the data back and to help, and to not only help individuals find that information, but also to help connect individuals who now have a shared experience that they didn't realize before. That now, if we can identify some of these genetic subtypes that, again, have their own unique risks and their own unique health issues, to begin connect those families and allow the communication to happen. Because certainly, I think one of the things that we don't always appreciate as sort of the research users of this data is just how empowering the underlying genetic information is to the families in guiding their decisions and how they move. And in fact, you can already see this in some circumstances. So the discovery of the role of CHD8 in autism has led to the small number of individuals who have been identified of having mutations of that gene coming together, settling on a few key experts in clinical centers, and really being able to pool themselves in a way to not only both enable the research, but enable their own understanding of their disease and be able to work together as a unit to further their specific understanding of that disease. So with that, I just want to acknowledge all the partners, and again, Google's been very important in helping us build the infrastructure behind this. Sick Kids has been our academic research partner, and then of course P3G and Bartha and her group helping us work through the legal and ethical issues in trying to get this built. Thank you.
Okay, we have time for maybe a couple questions. Are there any questions here? Here, why don't
So how many requests do you expect to receive from external researchers?
How many applications?
Yeah, data access.
Data access? I'd say it's we've already, even though it's not sort of officially rolled out, because there's already been a publication. So Stephen Shearer's published on the first 200 genomes. And with that publication, we've made that data accessible. And even with that limited amount of data, we've been fielding a pretty regular inquiries for access and been granting individuals access to the data already on that basis. And so, and again, that's under the condition that we're only dealing right now with individuals focused on questions around autism just because of where our informed consents are at this moment. But we've also had inquiries from groups looking at cancer, looking at CFTR mutations for cystic fibrosis, Gary Cutting's group, who want to have access to this kind of data set. So actually we expect a fairly significant number of applications just based on the sampling that we've already had.
Question. Do you have, over here, middle.
Oh, there you are.
Hi. Do you anticipate a fee for credentialing? Do you anticipate a fee for queries? And do you have a pricing model that you can speak to now?
As of right now, the Autism Speaks is covering all the costs. And so to the investigators, there's no cost for any of those activities.
Awesome, because that's not true of all the public portals. Thank you.
Yes.
Can you comment on the breadth of the clinical phenotype data you have and neuropsychological assessments? Because autism is a spectrum, so it'd be very important to have that sort of information built in.
Yes, so I mean, we're going to make so the samples that we're including in this are coming from a number of different academic consortiums that have built up these collections over the years. And so to a certain extent, part of the work that we have to undertake is just merging that data making sure that we have a homogenization of terms and that we're doing that sort of thing. But then also to that end, and more to your question, is that we're going to have some variation in the depth of phenotyping just between groups. Certainly in the case of Stephen's group, or also we're accessing the AGREE samples that Autism Speaks holds as well, that depth of characterization is pretty extensive. And it goes well beyond just your standard ADOS type of samples. So we do have a wealth of descriptive data for these individuals. And in the case of the samples coming out of the AGREE collection, you actually have video assessments that you can access and view of the individuals. So it's going to be varied, but certainly with the couple of initial groups that we're talking about, it is a very deep phenotype that we're talking about.
Because the gradations of a cognitive phenotype, it's not a plus minus.
Yes, no, certainly, yes.
Yes, Terry Vijnhoek, Utrecht in the Netherlands. So you're now sort of stuck to the consents that have been previously signed. Once you go to that universal consent and you gather all the data and you get requests for access, do you expect to actually have to deny access from certain researchers, and based on what criteria would that be then?
So as far as that goes, and if Bartha's around, I welcome her input on this question as well. But I would say that it's certainly one of the criteria that we've talked about putting in place and that we're going to implement as far as this goes, and I would think that we continue further, is in countries where they do maintain things like debarment lists because of people doing fraudulent research and those sorts of things. Those sorts of individuals would be rejected for access. And then I think at some level we would still like to have an understanding of the purpose for which someone is accessing the database, and just to make sure that there is a validity to the scientific question that's being asked, or again, the reason that they're accessing the data. So Barth, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, we have one more here. Let's take...
Bartha, I think, is going to make a comment on
I'm
the question.
sorry.
Well, I don't want to take away from the question, just to say, we heard already earlier this morning, we need to distinguish between what is emerging as a 3-level tier, the open, which we know about, the controlled, which we're used to, and a new level called registered access, just like the tiered consent. And for that, we still do have to establish the bona fides of a researcher. So there has to be, even in the restricted, which isn't the full DACO controlled, some way to verify and validate the seriousness not only of the scientific question, but the researcher integrity as well. And then reserve the controlled access for the more vulnerable or more complex or more serious or difficult types of research.
Okay, we need to move on to our next speaker, so I encourage you to find Matt and get your question answered.